He endured. He held up. He was able to hang in there. He didn't faint.
Pastor Charles Stanley's family finally breaks silence on his last days. It's not pretty. For 50 years, Charles Stanley preached about family values to millions. But behind closed doors, his own family was falling apart. His wife filed for divorce. His son abandoned the church. His daughter watched it all collapse. Now, years after his death in 2023, they're finally talking. What they revealed about his final days will shock you. The man in the pulpit wasn't the man at home, and the last 3 words he ever spoke changed everything between him and his son. Charles Stanley was born on September 25, 1932, in a small town in Virginia called Dry Fork. It was the middle of the Great Depression, when jobs were gone, families were hungry, and life felt hopeless for millions. His parents, Charlie Stanley and Rebecca Hall, were barely getting by. Bread lines stretched for blocks. People lost homes overnight. It was the worst time to raise a child. But somehow, that stormy beginning became the soil from which one of the most powerful voices in Christian ministry would rise. 9 months after Charles was born, everything changed. His father died suddenly, at just 29 years old. One day he was there, the next, gone. No goodbye, no memories left behind, just a name and silence. His mother, Rebecca, was left to raise an infant alone during the worst economic crisis in U.S. history. That sense of abandonment never left Charles. He often spoke about growing up with a hole in his heart, wondering who his father was and what kind of man he could have become under his guidance. That longing shaped how he would later talk about God as the Father who never leaves, never forgets, and never turns away. When Charles was 9, Rebecca remarried. She thought she was doing the right thing, giving her son the father figure he'd lost. But that decision nearly destroyed them both. Her new husband, John Hall, was an alcoholic with a violent temper. The nightmare began almost immediately. 2 weeks after the wedding, Rebecca realized she had married into a lie. Hall's own family had tricked her. They knew he was abusive. They told her he would change if he got married. He didn't. Worse, Charles lived in fear. He watched his stepfather choke his mother. He locked his bedroom door every night. Sometimes he even kept a loaded gun by his bed, just in case. He was a child living in a war zone. That trauma didn't just scar him, it built him. It taught him that survival takes faith, and that God, not man, is the only one you can truly trust. Through all the chaos at home, Charles found refuge in the church. His roots were Pentecostal. His grandfather, George Washington Stanley, helped found the Emmanuel Pentecostal Holiness Church in Dry Fork. His parents were active members, and Charles soaked up the fiery sermons, loud prayers, and deep emotion that came with Pentecostal worship. During the worst nights at home, he would escape to the church basement. There he prayed out loud, crying, shouting, begging God for peace. He learned to pour his heart out in prayer, not just whisper it. Even when he later became a Baptist, that Pentecostal fire never left him. It shaped how he spoke, how he preached, and how he led. At 17, something happened that changed everything. Charles visited his grandfather in Siler City, North Carolina. He was unsure about becoming a preacher. He felt too young, too broken, too weak. But his grandfather gave him one sentence that would guide his entire life. Charles, if God tells you to put your head through that brick wall, you run for it. It's His job to make the hole. That moment hit him like thunder. From then on, his core belief became simple: obey God and leave the consequences to Him. It wasn't just a motto. It was survival. When life gave no answers, obedience was his anchor. In the 1950s, Charles began his formal education. He started at the University of Richmond and later attended Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas. This was during a time when Bible colleges were booming. Enrollment had tripled since 1945. The world was changing fast, and Christianity was finding its new voice on radio and TV. Billy Graham's crusades had started in 1949. Evangelism was becoming a national force. Charles dove into it all, studying Greek, Hebrew, theology, and preaching. He wasn't just learning Scripture. He was learning how to make it real, how to bring it into people's pain. By 1957, Charles was just 25, but already serving as a pastor and teaching preaching at Fruitland Baptist Church in North Carolina. It was a small church, about 150 people in a mountain town, but it was exactly what he needed. He taught homiletics and evangelism at the Bible Institute nearby while pastoring full-time. His salary? Just $75 a week. But he didn't care. He was doing what he loved. He was learning how to lead, how to speak, and how to reach people in real-world struggles. Many of his members were farmers or factory workers dealing with poverty and uncertainty. He gave them more than sermons. He gave them hope. In 1958, he was officially ordained as a Baptist minister at just 26 years old. That was unusually young. Most pastors were ordained in their 30s. But Charles was ready. His timing was perfect. Television evangelism was exploding. Billy Graham was on every channel. Oral Roberts had just launched his own TV ministry. Charles would soon follow. That same year, his ordination certificate gave him the right to baptize, marry, and lead churches. But more importantly, it marked the start of a new kind of ministry, one that would eventually reach millions around the world. Between 1959 and 1968, Charles moved a lot, first to Fairborn, Ohio, then Miami, Florida, and finally Bartow, Florida. Each church brought new challenges. In Fairborn, he led a church near a massive Air Force base. The town was growing fast because of Cold War buildup. In Miami, he pastored during the Cuban Missile Crisis and saw his church double from 400 to over 800 members. But even with the success, he kept moving. By 1968, he took a smaller church in Bartow, a quiet city of 12,000 people. Most would call it a step backward, but for Charles, it was a chance to build something real. He wanted to start from scratch and grow deep roots. That period of restlessness wasn't failure. It was training. He was sharpening his skills, learning from every community, and waiting for the moment that would change everything. When Charles Stanley first walked into First Baptist Atlanta in 1969, he had no idea what kind of war he was stepping into. The church was split. Factions were fighting over theology and politics, and Stanley, just the associate pastor, stood right in the middle of it. One meeting got so heated, someone actually punched him. But he didn't walk away. He stayed. For 2 long, brutal years, he endured the tension, the whisper campaigns, and the outright hostility. Then came October 1st, 1971. That day, the church held a standing vote to decide if Stanley should become senior pastor. The room was tense. Emotions were raw. But when the votes were counted, the answer was clear. Yes. At 39 years old, Stanley was now the 16th pastor of one of the South's most influential churches. But it came at a price. Many who opposed him walked out for good, leaving behind a church that was bruised and broken, but also finally ready to move forward. Just 1 year later, he took an even bigger risk. In 1972, Stanley launched the Chapel Hour on 2 local Atlanta TV stations, WXIA TV 11 and Wonks 46. It was just a half-hour show. Nothing fancy, but it reached 16,000 local viewers, and that was enough to get attention. Behind the scenes, Christian networks were searching for voices that felt practical and real. Stanley's no-nonsense Bible teaching fit the bill. In 1978, the Christian Broadcasting Network reached out. They were building a new satellite system and needed content. Stanley said yes. In 1 week, his audience jumped from 16,000 in Atlanta to a nationwide reach. The program got a new name, In Touch with Dr. Charles Stanley, and a whole new identity. By the early 1980s, it was on TV in almost every major American city. Then it went global. By the end, Stanley's message was being broadcast in 114 languages across 150 countries. But his media empire didn't begin with cameras. It began with classrooms. Back in 1966, 5 years before his television breakthrough, Stanley founded the George Mueller Christian School in Miami. He was still a pastor at First Baptist Miami at the time. The school wasn't just about education. It was about values. It was named after George Mueller, a Christian leader who famously cared for orphans using only prayer and faith. That name mattered. Stanley believed in bringing faith into everyday life, especially into how kids were raised and taught. At the same time, he was finishing his graduate degree. Balancing school, a church, and launching a school? That showed the kind of drive that would later define his national ministry. He left Miami in 1968, moved to Bartow, Florida, and by 1969 was headed for Atlanta. But those early years proved something. Stanley wasn't just thinking about Sunday sermons. He was thinking big. And that thinking never stopped. When Stanley took over First Baptist Atlanta, it had around 5,000 members. By the 1990s, that number tripled. The church needed more space. In 1997, he made a controversial decision. He sold the historic Midtown Atlanta property and moved the entire church to the suburb of Dunwoody. The new building could seat 3,000 people. It was modern, sleek, and ready for the future. But Stanley wasn't just focused on numbers. He built programs. One of the most famous was the Passion Play, a dramatic reenactment of Jesus' final week. It ran from 1977 to 2011 and involved hundreds of volunteers. Under Stanley's leadership, the church became a machine of ministry, media, and outreach. When he stepped down in 2020 after nearly 50 years, First Baptist Atlanta wasn't just a church, it was a national institution. But perhaps the biggest change came in 1978, when technology gave his ministry wings. That year, CBN's satellite network turned the chapel hour into In Touch and changed everything. It wasn't a slow rise. Within 1 week, Stanley's face was beamed into homes across America. That kind of exposure was unheard of for a preacher back then. But Stanley wasn't afraid of the spotlight. He embraced it. In 1982, he made it official. He incorporated In Touch Ministries as its own nonprofit. That gave him total freedom to expand. And he did. Radio syndication began that same year. Soon, he was reaching over 115 million households in the U.S. alone. But he didn't stop there. He pushed into the most remote parts of the planet, with technology almost no one else was using. He became obsessed with innovation. Stanley believed technology wasn't just useful, it was essential. He wanted to reach everyone, even people in villages with no power. So, he launched Messenger Lab, 8 different solar-powered audio devices designed for people with no internet, no electricity, and no church. One device could play 65 of his sermons, plus the New Testament, Psalms, and Proverbs, in 2 languages. Over time, more than 1 million messenger devices were given away. The total value we use over $26 million. And they didn't just go to one region. These devices reached every continent, including Antarctica. Meanwhile, Stanley's sermons aired on more than 4,000 outlets across radio, TV, and satellite. He was in 127 languages. He was on mobile apps, digital platforms, podcasts, you name it, all because he believed this was the greatest moment in history to spread the gospel. And he wasn't just a media giant, he was a political lightning rod too. In 1984, Stanley became president of the Southern Baptist Convention. It was one of the most controversial times in the denomination's history. The SBC was in a full-on civil war over biblical inerrancy, whether the Bible was completely true in every way, including science. Conservatives called it the conservative resurgence. Moderates called it a takeover. Stanley won the presidency with just 52% of the vote. Barely. But it was enough. He served 2 terms from 1984 to 1986. During that time, he also led the Peace Committee, formed in 1985 to resolve the fight. The committee's report ran 6,450 words after 15 intense meetings, and it confirmed what Stanley and other conservatives were saying. From then on, the SBC moved in a new, more theologically conservative direction, and Stanley was right in the middle of that shift. From a Miami school in 1966, to a church brawl in 1971, to a satellite empire in the 1980s, Charles Stanley never stopped pushing forward. In February 1988, Charles Stanley stood at the peak of his public career. He had just been inducted into the National Religious Broadcasters Hall of Fame. It was a huge moment. His sermons were reaching more than 115 million households across America, and In Touch with Dr. Charles Stanley had become a staple on Christian radio and television. He wasn't just another preacher. He was the face of a movement, a leader shaping the future of Christian media. But while the world was celebrating him, something much darker was happening at home. A year later, in 1989, Stanley traveled to Kansas City for a ministry rally. While praying in his hotel room, he stared out the window and noticed dozens of satellite dishes on nearby rooftops. In that moment, he said God gave him a message. This would be the way to send the gospel around the world. He remembered Psalm 67:2. Send us around the world with the news of your saving power. That moment became a turning point. His sermons would go on to be translated into 127 languages and broadcast through over 4,000 networks globally. But while the message was going out, the man behind it was coming apart. His wife, Anna, had been feeling increasingly abandoned. Charles was gone more and more, chasing church growth and expanding his ministry reach. She once said, "He chose his priorities, and I have not been one of them." She wasn't speaking in anger. She was speaking from years of pain. By the early 1990s, Anna had stopped attending his church services altogether. Their son, Andy, who would later become a megachurch pastor himself, watched it all unfold. The cold silences, the growing distance, the slow collapse of a marriage that had lasted nearly 4 decades. In June 1993, Anna finally filed for divorce. She didn't use her full name, just A.J. Stanley. But there was no mistaking who it was. The papers claimed their marriage was irretrievably broken. Evangelical circles exploded. This was Charles Stanley, the man who preached about family values every Sunday. And now, his own marriage was unraveling in public. The backlash came fast. Some pastors turned their backs on him. Others demanded he step down from the pulpit. The shock wasn't just about the divorce. It was about the image. Stanley had built a reputation around the very thing he was now accused of failing. But the story didn't end quickly. Anna withdrew the petition at one point, hoping for reconciliation. When that didn't work, she refiled in 1995. For 7 years, the Stanleys lived in a state of painful limbo. Legally married, emotionally distant, and publicly scrutinized. Christian radio stations dropped his sermons. Some church leaders privately urged him to resign. But Stanley kept preaching, week after week. It wasn't just persistence, it was defiance. The Southern Baptist Convention was not amused. Stanley had once served as its president. Now, they were calling for him to step down. He had even told his own congregation years earlier that if he ever got divorced, he'd leave the ministry. Now he was divorced, or close to it, and still behind the pulpit. Even members of his staff resigned. His son, Andy, too. The divorce was finalized on May 11, 2000. The judge signed off on what was officially an uncontested case. Charles was 67 years old. His sermons were being broadcast in 50 languages, but at that moment, he was no longer a husband. The man who once defined Christian family values had lost his own family. Anna would remain single until her death in 2014. Charles never remarried. Church bylaws allowed him to stay as pastor, as long as he didn't take another wife. He addressed his congregation shortly after the final papers were signed. Calmly, he said, "God has assured me I'm where He wants me to be, doing what He has called me to do." And then, the shocker. His church overwhelmingly supported him. The Board of Deacons voted 35-3 to keep him. In a later interview, Stanley said something that stunned many. "I never felt like I really even divorced her. She asked for it. I responded to it." That single line captured the depth of denial, or conviction, depending on how you saw it. But not everyone agreed. Andy Stanley had quietly walked away from First Baptist Atlanta years earlier. He didn't just leave the church, he left the entire dynasty. He was supposed to inherit the pulpit. Instead, he broke away and launched a church of his own. In 1995, he gathered a group of people and formed North Point Community Church. It wasn't just a new building, it was a whole new philosophy. He said, "Atlanta doesn't need another church. What it needs is a safe space for the unchurched." It was a not-so-subtle jab at everything his father's ministry represented. By the end of the first year, over 4,000 people were attending North Point. Today, the church reaches over 43,000 people across multiple locations. It was an empire in its own right, and it had nothing to do with Charles Stanley. The father had one of the biggest ministries in the world. The son built one of the largest churches in the country. And they weren't even speaking. Their feud became legendary. Christian media couldn't stop talking about it. Everyone had a theory: an affair, mental illness, control issues, jealousy. Whatever the reason, the silence between father and son became symbolic of everything wrong with evangelical leadership. Two men who taught forgiveness, but couldn't offer it to each other. Eventually, they tried counseling, weekly sessions, brutal honesty. One day, Andy asked the counselor, "When do I give up on my dad?" The counselor replied, "When your heavenly Father gives up on you." That line hit hard. Slowly, painfully, they began to talk again. One lunch meeting changed everything. Charles looked at his son and said, "I don't want us to end up like all those other fathers and sons." Andy answered softly, "Me neither, Dad." By 2013, Andy's North Point Community Church had grown to about 30,000 members across 5 campuses. It had become the second-largest church in the United States. Even more remarkable? His father, Charles Stanley, the same man who had once felt abandoned by Andy's departure, stood at his own pulpit and praised him, publicly, passionately. That same Charles who had once taken subtle jabs at Andy during sermons now proudly told his congregation about Andy's church-planting plans. He even gave his blessing. Privately, Charles admitted those words didn't come easy. The wounds were still fresh, but he said them anyway. That blessing marked a major shift. Years earlier, they could hardly speak. But over time, things changed. They didn't just speak. They preached for each other's churches. The same father who once saw his son as a rebel now saw him as a partner. And Andy never forgot that. He knew he had a front-row seat growing up, learning from one of the most powerful preachers in America. Charles had led First Baptist Atlanta for over 5 decades. He'd even been president of the Southern Baptist Convention. But now, he was watching his son lead a new generation. In Charles's final months, everything slowed down. He couldn't move much. He spent his days in a big leather chair, his body too weak to carry him anymore. But his mind? Still sharp, his heart still on fire. Andy visited often, and every time he knelt beside that chair. They would talk. Then Charles would say, "Pray for me." This became their new rhythm, a rhythm of healing. Andy said those visits were precious beyond words. That chair became a sacred space, a symbol of peace between two men who had once been distant. Charles no longer stood on stages. He no longer thundered from the pulpit. But in that chair, through quiet prayers, he found something just as powerful. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when their dinners were silent and strained. They'd sit in restaurants, knowing they should talk, but not knowing how. The divorce between Charles and Andy's mother, Anna, had shattered more than just a marriage. It had shaken their bond as father and son. Charles admitted he was afraid of what might happen between them. "We've both seen what happens to fathers and sons who go through something like this," he told Andy once. "And I don't want that to happen to us." That fear pushed them to rebuild. Slowly, steadily. It took nearly 25 years. Then came the phrase that changed everything. "I couldn't be prouder of you, Andy." He said it more than once. It became his habit. He didn't just mean it, he wanted Andy to know it. Coming from Charles Stanley, those words carried weight. Andy said it best. The source of a word determines its weight. Charles could have held on to old arguments. Andy had taken bold theological stances, ones that ruffled feathers. He'd challenged traditions. But Charles never scolded him publicly. He never lashed out over Andy's views on the Old Testament or LGBTQ+ issues. Instead, he said those 7 words, over and over, and they healed something no sermon ever could. The final moment between them was something out of a storybook. It was Saturday night, April 15th, 2023, just 3 days before Charles passed away. Andy visited like he always did. He expected the same routine: kneel beside the chair, say a prayer, hear a quiet "thank you." But this time, something shifted. As Andy got up to leave, Charles asked, "Can I pray for you?" It was the only time he'd done that. Andy didn't know it then, but it would be the last thing his father would ever say to him. He prayed, and then he said it again. "I couldn't be prouder of you, Andy." Those were his final words to his son. At 7:30 a.m. on Tuesday, April 18th, 2023, Charles Stanley passed away. He was 90 years old. His ministry had started when he was just 14. It ended after reaching every continent through 2,800 radio and TV outlets in 150 countries. His sermons were translated into 114 languages. For 66 years, he preached. For 50 of those, he led First Baptist Atlanta. He stepped down in 2020, becoming pastor emeritus. But the mission didn't end with him. His In Touch Ministries kept going, and still goes on. Becky Stanley Broderson, his daughter, didn't make many public statements. But she lived through it all. The ministry highs, the family lows. She saw her father's dedication to his calling, but also the toll it took. Their mother, Anna, had filed for divorce in 1993. It wasn't final until 2000. She later said, Charles refused to admit their marriage was falling apart. Becky watched her parents' relationship dissolve in public, but she stayed close. She was there when the final chapter was written, and in the obituary, her name stood beside Andy's. In Touch Ministries didn't just survive, it grew into one of the most powerful evangelical networks in history. It started as the Chapel Hour in 1972. By 2017, it was broadcasting on more than 2,800 stations, translated into 114 languages, and reaching people in 150 countries. Just in the U.S., it was on 500 radio stations and 300 TV networks. Even tribal communities in remote areas heard Charles Stanley preach, thanks to satellite and digital outreach. His sermons didn't fade when he stepped down. They became permanent, archived, ready for the next generation. But none of that fully captured the contradiction at the heart of his life. Charles Stanley, who taught about family values, couldn't keep his own family from falling apart. His wife walked away. His son once felt betrayed. His daughter saw the cost of a global ministry up close. He preached about healing, but had to learn how to do it himself. He was raised by an alcoholic stepfather. That survival instinct, fierce and unyielding, made him a powerhouse in the pulpit. But it also made him hard to live with. That paradox didn't weaken his message. It made it real.